Thank you very much, well, welcome to one of our Transatlantic webinars, Game Changer Trend Accelerator, the International Politics of COVID-19. And of course, we're all struggling with the health consequences of COVID-19, but at the same time, we also see that politics is not changing. Politics is continuing and it's definitely developing. And of course, we all, have our own little theories how the post-COVID-19 politics will look like. And of course, this is something we don't really know. We're still exploring the possibilities. And of course, what we struggle with is, will the COVID-19 be a game changer? Will that be changing the international politics? Or will it simply be an accelerator of what we've seen before? Or for that matter, could it be something that shifts the international politics into something old or new? And I think we have three very interesting speakers here. For beginning, we're going to start with Alice Ekman, who is a Senior Analyst in charge of Asia at the European Union Institute for Security Studies and the CSCAP-EU Coordinator. And despite her fabulous name, she's not Swedish, she's actually French. And then we have Dr. Carla Freeman. She's Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, where she is also an Associate Research Professor in China Studies. And lastly, we will have Dr. Michael Green, who's the Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic International Studies and Director of Asian Studies and Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Long titles, and I hope that they will sort of signal that we will have a very, very interesting discussion. But when myself, I'm Niklas Sandström, I'm heading ISDP, but you haven't come to listen to me, or you haven't turned on your computer. So I would like to turn the floor over to Alice and to have her present her views on this. And then we will move on to Carla and then finally to Michael. So Alice, the camera is yours.
Thank you so much, Niklas, for the kind invitation and for the introduction. I'm very happy to be part of this event. Same for all the events that you've been organizing, always great discussion. You just said that politics is not changing, and actually I fully agree with you, and I would argue that COVID-19 is, in my opinion, an accelerator of existing trends and not a game changer. This being said, these trends are accelerating fastly, and I will list them. I identify 5 trends that COVID-19 is currently accelerating, and that is structuring the world order in many respects. So, and I will identify this trend taking into account China's ambition, China's foreign policy and security ambition, given that I've been focusing on China in my work for over the last decade. First trend that is accelerating, in my opinion, at the time of COVID-19, is clearly a competition between political systems. To be clear, as many of you have seen, there has been a very tense communication war between several governments at official level, between diplomats, even when it is usually considered that diplomats are soft-spoken. Clearly, at least for example in Paris, but also in Brussels, it has not been so much a case recently, with communication surrounding the crisis on presumed efficiency of the Chinese management of the crisis and the presumed inefficiency or weaknesses of other ways to manage a crisis. And this has been, this communication campaign and exchange and overall competition between political systems is a long trend that has been revealed to a larger public during the COVID-19 crisis, but that has really been noticeable, observable since the arrival of Xi Jinping at the General Secretariat of the CPC at the end of 2012. Already by then, and shortly after he was appointed to the presidency in early 2013, he clearly mentioned black and white in a closed door meeting in front of the Central Committee that socialism is superior to capitalism, and that he believes in the ultimate victory of socialism over capitalism. This may seem anachronic, but clearly there is an ideological frame here that is structuring a competition between political systems that is not just appearing in Chinese official speeches, but also noticeable in, for example, training programs that are offered by China to a number of officials from developing countries, where China is presenting itself as a solution provider, as an example to follow. And even if it does not use the term model, clearly, it hopes that it will become a political system, a governance system of reference for diversity of issue, to manage diversity of crisis, being medical, social, economical, etc., etc. And I don't see any sign of this competition between political system being softened or being affected by the crisis. On the contrary, I see it as an accelerator for the coming years. The second trend that I think is accelerating at the time of COVID-19 is a competition between forms of globalization. As you were in Brussels, in Paris, but I guess also in many other European capitals, there is a general questioning about globalization, the efficiency, the weaknesses of globalization, general rationale behind it. I mean, many, I would say, profound questions are now asked and considered at the time of COVID-19 about also dependency on faraway markets, etc., etc. This is not new, but why I mention competing form of globalization is because already well before the crisis, China officially had the ambition to promote an alternative form of globalization. Actually, that's how the Belt and Road Initiative has been repackaged since 2017. Belt and Road Initiative is not just about transport infrastructure, it's about actually flows of goods through transport of infrastructure, but also of data, of people, of ideas in various ways, and how China would like to better shape, control, or supervise these flows so that it is not dependent on control mechanism or standard and norms that has been shaped by other countries, and first and foremost, Western powers, the US or European countries. In the framework of the COVID-19 crisis, China has continued to promote the Belt and Road Initiative as a solution or as an assistance provider at the time of COVID-19. As you were aware, China mentioned the Health Silk Road that was already existing in 2017. China also pushed forward digital Silk Road through, for instance, donation of technological equipment to various countries, including, for example, video conference equipment to governments being Pakistan, for instance, or Kenya, or having sent drones, or having sent thermal camera, AI-supported camera that are able to measure temperature to government of Lebanon, for instance. These donations are rather small in number, but they show a bigger trend of China step by step, wishing under the Belt and Road Initiative, wishing to continue to promote not only new infrastructure projects, but a diversity of services and infrastructure that could step by step shape an alternative form of globalization that is developed in parallel with an existing one. A third trend on this, I just want to mention before jumping to the same trend, because I think it's important, is that China increasingly is trying to position itself as a solution provider in time of at time of this crisis. And the sanitary and logistical assistance that we have been observing is likely also to evolve more and more into towards technological and to some extent and towards some country financial assistance under two labels, because China is partly bridging the anti-epidemic label that it has been using, for instance, in the margin of the G20 with the BRI label. So basically, BRI Belt and Road Initiative would be a vector, I mean, it would be a solution to recover to the present crisis in many areas. Of course, this is official positioning, but I think it's important to analyze because it has been promoted quite actively by the Chinese diplomacy over the last weeks. So trends that I think is accelerating in the present context is it's competing form of global governance restructuring. As you've been aware, competition of views and influence have been very sharp within the WHO. This is a tip of the iceberg. China has been promoting a very ambitious global governance strategy more than decades ago, and has invested in diversity of multilateral framework, hoping that step by step China could partly reform and restructure some existing institutions from the inside by being active, but also at the same time create new institutions such as the AIIB, Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank in 2014. This trend is likely to continue and accelerate at time of COVID-19. China is still, even under strong criticism, still very active within WHO, but also other institution of the UN system, and China is likely to continue to be active within the G20, the BRICS grouping, the SCO, and also likely to organize new edition of the Belt and Road Forum, which is partly perceived in Beijing as alternative multilateral forum. So step by step, I mean, in the present context, an assumption that is often promoted or shared is that basically China, with the challenges that it faces at home, economic slowdown, potential political tension, although this is not clear and we should be careful with this, but that China basically does not have the means of its ambition and does not have the means for very active diplomacy. I disagree with this, because first of all, some of the initiatives that China is promoting are less costly than building a bridge, a road, or an airport. So even if China reduces its downscale its ambition in terms of transport infrastructure, I'm not sure it will downscale its ambition in terms of institutional activism, in terms of firm organization, in terms of bilateral mechanism creation and development, as it has done over the last 6 years, because its ambitions are very strong in this field, and also they are not always it's not just a matter of budget, and China's diplomatic budget so far has not been reduced, and China has the largest diplomatic network when we count the number of embassies and consulates abroad. The fourth accelerating trend in this context, in my opinion, is clearly the technological divide. I briefly mentioned it in my first point, but let me elaborate here. At the time of COVID-19, China is accelerating its investments in diversity of technology through what is now labeled the new infrastructure plan. So new infrastructure plan basically, as it has been announced since end of March, and more recently at the annual meeting in Beijing, is that China is counting is planning to accelerate investment in 5G network on its territory, in also a new energy vehicle, in the development of data center, Internet of Things. The list is long. I won't develop it too much, but the figures are here. The work report that was been presented recently state that the local government will be allowed by the National People Congress to issue special bonds worth 3.75 trillion yuan, so more than $500 billion this year. And it's a sharp increase compared to last year. And the central government will also allocate 600 billion yuan to local government to fuel this infrastructure investment. This development, this investment are taking place at a time of, as you know, very strong technological tension between Washington and Beijing. And most likely tension over 5G are likely to extend to other technologies, and it is already the case. Technologies including surveillance cameras, including, of course, data center, including blockchain, which is already also a priority for Beijing, blockchain development on its territory and beyond, with China having the ambition to position itself as a leading global provider in these technologies. So overall, I really see COVID-19, or at least the recovery plan that China has been announced over the last week in the present context, as an accelerator of the pre-existing trend, which is technological decoupling between China and the US, given that tensions are still very deep and multi-layered in this field. The last trend that I would like to share with you is really to wonder. I mean, it's a question and a trend, but the trend is a blurred bipolarization of the world. Basically, when we analyze the fourth previously mentioned trend, we clearly see that tension between Washington and Beijing are extremely deep, multi-layered, and are increasingly violent in a sense, from a communication viewpoint, from a technological viewpoint, from an ideological and political viewpoint, whatever angle we look at it, from an institutional viewpoint as well. We could also talk about US approach to a WHO recently. The key question that is often asked is that, okay, China has ambition, China is very active diplomatically, but will it succeed in reaching this ambition? Will it succeed in convincing countries to join its initiative, to support its position at the UN, at the WHO, and other institutions? My answer is that we should be aware of that there is a mixed reception of China's initiative today. Undoubtedly, China is increasingly irritating a certain number of countries, and in particular thinking about European countries, but not only. Recent communication over the COVID-19 it has been reinforcing this irritation, and has backfired to some extent in many countries, and these countries will certainly look more closely in a more skeptical way when at China's initiative, and we look carefully at China's activism within international organizations in the coming months and years, including within WHO. But other countries are also showing a different approach, much more receptive to China's initiative, China's assistance in the present context. I'm thinking about Serbia, I'm thinking about Pakistan, I'm thinking about Laos, Cambodia. I'm also to some extent thinking, even if the relationship is complex and multi-layered, I'm thinking about Russia. I don't think China-Russia rapprochement has been put into question by the COVID-19 crisis. On the contrary, I think it has consolidated, and I could elaborate on this in the Q&A session if needed. But all in all, I see poles of countries currently emerging, with China trying to consolidate with some difficulties its circle of friends. It is not succeeding in doing so, but at the same time, it is not as isolated as we tend to argue. And China is not talking about building alliances. China is not talking about signing alliance treaty or about formal partnership with the diversity of countries. It is, I would say, promoting, or it is purposely entertaining certain form of blurriness or ambiguity about the geographical scope of its circle of friends. This is the Chinese official expression, basically by proposing its initiative to an as large number of countries as possible. For instance, when it's proposing a Belt and Road Memorandum of Understanding, proposing it to a diversity of countries, including allies of the US. Same for the AIIB, that, as you know, several European countries have joined. Same for when Chinese tech companies are proposing their infrastructure and solution, from 5G to video surveillance cameras to data center. The offer is as large as possible, and this is certainly creating a transatlantic tension, strong transatlantic tension. And by itself, at a time where China is entertaining a certain form of strategic ambiguity about the scope of its partnership, the US, on the other side, is expecting more clarity and a clarification of the position of its allies on Chinese initiatives and offers. Will you develop or not 5G by Huawei 5G network on your territory? Will you sign or not the Belt and Road MOU? Clearly, with Washington, of course, expecting a formal opposition of its allies as a response to China's proposal. I think this, I would say, asymmetry of positioning, ambiguous positioning at the time of China, on the side of China, but China still being very much proactive and keeping the rhythm of the initiative, and Washington expecting clarification and partly withdrawing of a framework or initiative that it considered under Chinese influence. I think this asymmetry represents actually a challenge, not only for the US, but also for the alliance, and should be taken into account seriously. Overall, I think we should not underestimate China's foreign policy ambition at the time of COVID, because I think it is, even in a case of a reduced budget, political ambition is still very, very, very strong, and this matters at the time of this competition.
So thank you very much. I think I can start my video as well. Thank you very much for that. I think excellent introduction, sort of a European perspective on this. We already starting to receive questions. We'll take all the questions afterwards. But then I would like to invite Carla to take up the camera, and then maybe to spin on this and give us your perspective on this.
Thank you, Nicholas. Well, good morning. It's good morning for me, and good afternoon to the audience, and it's a pleasure. Can you hear me? Okay. I hope I can take a so-called pandemic check and get to Stockholm in the future. But in the meanwhile, I hope everybody is well. We were asked to think about what the impact on the coronavirus on international politics will be going forward, and whether it will mark a major break from the past, or will it mainly accelerate trends already in place. You know, last night I spent a lot of time watching more unrest unfold in the U.S. on television, and then I'll listen to the calls for a military response by the Trump administration. And so, you know, it seems to me that how things unfold in the United States is really a key piece of the answer to that question. But since, like Alice, I do work on China, I thought I might most usefully contribute to today's discussion by trying to focus on the US-China dimension of the question. And my answer to the question of whether the virus is a game changer in the sense of the international balance of power is that it is dramatically accelerating changes that were already at play. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that we're going to emerge from our homes or our bunkers after the pandemic and all of its societal reverberations to find that China is running the world. But we are going to find the world even more stressed, even more fractured, and certainly one in which American credibility as a global leader, a partner, and an ally has been acutely damaged. That said, the US still has substantial military, technological, and of course financial power, and the world is going to continue to face threats where all of these assets can be used, I'll use the word redemptively, to address conventional threats to our security, but also if we can get our act together to address the many issues of human survival that we're going to continue to face in the immediate years to come. Obviously, the pandemic shock is still reverberating in the United States and is playing out globally. In the United States, as of this morning, the Johns Hopkins University, where I work, reports, the website reports that the United States has 1.8 million cases and more than 105,000 deaths. And globally, of course, there now are more than 6 million cases and creeping up to 400,000 deaths. And cases are rising in the developing world. China, where accumulating evidence suggests that a key strain of the virus emerged in the south part of the country, has only had, I mean, it's not only, but has had less than 5,000 deaths since China first reported the virus to the WHO in the United States in early January. I'm not going to go into, obviously, that we don't have time, the details of the Chinese response to the virus, but there are a number of excellent analyses, including a recent piece by Yanzhong Huang in something called the China Leadership Monitor, which describes the lack of transparency and risk communication problems that impeded flows of information in China from the bottom up. After listening to Alice's superb outline of trends, I'm going to rethink a little bit my remarks, and I think it might be useful for me to get into the weeds a bit here and just pick up on her mention of the current state of the U.S.-China relationship, because I think that illustrates the evidence is that we're in a nadir, and it also is illustrative of the challenges that the U.S. faces in leading and in our diplomacy in general. When the virus initially emerged in China, of course, it came at a moment when the U.S. and China had reached a truce in their trade war, and there was hope, actually, that the crisis could be an opportunity for a new shift toward rebuilding what had been a very fraught relationship with the trade war at the center of it. China informed the United States about the virus again in early January, and Trump was praising President Trump well into early February. But by mid-March, the relationship was reaching new levels of strain. And it was really after the stock market dropped in mid-March, dropped in one day about 3,000 points, that Trump began calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. And of course, then the G7 met and was unable to issue a joint statement over Secretary of State Pompeo's insistence that the group label the virus the Wuhan virus in its statement. By late April, early May, with new infections at about zero, China was trumpeting victory, and you saw a real war of words intensify between the White House and Chinese officials. And a Chinese diplomat had accused, even before that, the U.S. military of being the source of the virus. And in early May, Trump called the outbreak worse than Pearl Harbor. Pompeo accused China of a cover-up, charging the Chinese with hatching the virus in a lab, et cetera, et cetera. And there have been states now, U.S. states, who have filed a lawsuit over China's handling of the virus, which most legal assessments agree have weak, if any, legal foundations. And then just a couple of weeks ago, Trump even talked about cutting off economic relations with China entirely. And then a few days ago, he accusing the WHO of conspiring with China, he announced that the United States would terminate its relationship with the WHO, also stating at that event where he made that announcement, the world needs answers from China on the virus. We must have transparency. And I think there are legitimate concerns about the Chinese system, but as my recitation shows, we now stand at a point where there is no meaningful dialogue between the United States and only intensifying animosity. Managing the U.S.-China relationship, even before Donald Trump took office was not easy, and was never going to be easy under any president. The United States and China were increasingly at odds, not only militarily, but also in the economic domain. And it was very clear that China was using its growing power to press for its national objectives, including in areas of the world like the Western Pacific, where the United States has very clear interests. However, during the Obama administration, there was an effort to pursue a strategy that would perpetuate American advantages and try to socialize or enmesh, even, if you will, China in the US-led order. And there were certainly missed opportunities, but like the delays in ratifying quota reform in the IMF and so forth. But I think during the Obama administration, especially after the global financial crisis was beginning to be resolved, the general effort was to search for a steady state. And the Obama administration, of course, repeatedly labeled the US-China relationship its most consequential relationship. This, even as Xi Jinping turned to nationalism to strengthen the CCP's position and made clear that his vision for China was one that included restoring China as a great, if not perhaps even the greatest global power. The Obama administration made global challenges areas of focus for the two countries to work on together. Climate change and non-proliferation are two of those. And in Asia, although China made a lot of the Obama administration's pivots, deployment of additional military assets to the region, the Obama administration's proposals also included propositions like the TPP, and which would have set higher environmental and other standards for trade, including putting issues like IPR on the regional agenda. China was excluded from that initial agreement, but there were, it wasn't closed to China with reforms to the Chinese economy. In short, under the Obama administration, there was a lot of effort, including a whole of government approach through an annual strategic dialogue to manage this increasingly difficult US-China relationship, engaging US allies and partners, cultivating some new ones, Myanmar and Vietnam, there were many weaknesses again in the policies, but it allowed for both cooperation and intensifying competition in certain arenas. And I think Obama gets mixed reviews for his track record on Europe, but he bolstered the US commitment to NATO. Of course, the Trump administration, as I just described by elaborating the US-China relationship in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, has taken a completely different approach. And its China agenda has been, with perhaps the exception being North Korea, one that has emphasized threats posed by China and has ratcheted up tensions, I would say, without clear objectives, seemingly reflecting an assessment that the United States is better off by trying to live as if a country with a massive economy, 20% of the world's population, doesn't affect it. The trade war launched by the administration has exacted enormous economic costs on US companies and consumers, and gains have gone to other countries. We have very legitimate concerns about IPR theft, security concerns about Huawei. These date back to the early to 2010 discussions about Huawei in the Obama administration. But the latest move, which may be effective in preventing Huawei's dominance in new mobile technology, the weaponization essentially of US technology dominance in semiconductor manufacturing, is going to have really uncertain repercussions for US interests, because it's going to affect networks in 170 countries. So the Trump administration's America First sort of green eye shade view of alliances has also made strengthening those alliances and partnerships difficult. And meanwhile, Washington has been shredding global agreements that most analysts saw as net beneficial to the United States, and also some bilateral ones. The Open Skies Treaty is one of the latest, and then of course the announcement of plans to withdraw from the WHO is another. In addition, the U.S. has been slow to respond to clear opportunities to use U.S. economic power to invest in countries in response, for example, to China's BRI concept. We've offered some limited technical assistance rather than broader incentives to American companies to try to compete with China and so forth. And this is in part because the Trump administration has sidelined and demoralized agencies that normally would have developed and implemented a robust policy. I can go on. It's a bit of a rant. It's a bit frustrating. Chinese leaders, meanwhile, have matched the Trump America First policy by literally by donning a globalist mantle. And one might recall that Mao is alleged to have said, everything under heaven is in utter chaos. The situation is excellent. And I think China is trying to find in this global disruption a chance for it to fill the void in US leadership. And as Alice described so far, China's efforts at mask diplomacy in trying to use the crisis to boost its own diplomatic face overseas has had mixed effects. But atop its economic statecraft, it is positioning itself as a prospective provider of global public goods, and that is making inroads, particularly in many parts of the emerging world where the US is not present. And without the US presence in international institutions, we've handed China the platform. So what the trend at the moment is toward a world in which the US and China are estranged, so much so that even in the midst of a global crisis, they cannot work together for human security. And I fear that this is only going to get worse as the US election draws near in China, which is already and becomes more of a political football. The US has strained relations with its allies and its partners before, but unlike the Cold War, where it once had support for isolating and containing its adversary, its strategic competitor, while hardly seen as benign by the rest of the world, again, as Alice described, indeed, it's seen as a systemic rival in the arena of global governance, and there are ideological concerns. It is also seen as an economic opportunity and a fact of global life that will have to be addressed, even if that requires muscular management. I'm going on too long, but I just wanted to say that as the US, sort of conclude with this thought, as the US and China battle, instead of powers coalescing around one or the other, what is interesting is that other centers of international power are trying to find their own way. This trend existed before, witnessed our European allies joining the China-launched AIIB, for example, as founding members. And ASEAN has announced its own Indo-Pacific initiative last year that called for an Indo-Pacific region of dialogue and cooperation. It's very clear that we now have a world fractured politically. There's little appetite for a new Cold War between the United States and China. China has presented itself as an alternative provider of global public goods. It's not at all clear it's capable of doing this at a global level. Its record to date is one of opportunism, and it faces its own huge domestic economic challenges, international concerns about the direction of China's political system, its intolerance of criticism, etc. All of those are among the issues that raise questions about its capacity for global leadership. So this leaves a gap. It presents an opportunity for the United States to re-engage in global leadership, to rebuild its reputation, and to do the good things for the world. But the United States is going to have to engage in some soul searching, regain vision, something that's going to necessitate leadership at this juncture of division in the United States that it's not at all clear our political system is going to produce. So I'll stop there.
So thank you very much, Carla. Fascinating presentation as always. I would just like to hand over to Michael, see what if you agree with the two previous speakers, or you want to add some spice into the soup and see what we can get from it. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I generally agree with both of the presentations, which I think achieved a very good balance between what is old and what is new, what is accelerating. And I agree with both Alice and Carla that for the most part, we're seeing the stress on the international system from COVID-19 accelerating trends. Most of those trends, unfortunately, are trends towards entropy, not cooperation. This is the first major global crisis in my lifetime that did not see an acceleration of international collaboration and creation of new institutions. When you think about 9/11, when I was in the White House, when you think about the 2008 financial crisis, maybe the 2004 or 5 tsunami in Asia, I mean, all of these led to new partnerships, new patterns of cooperation, and some new institutions, regional or even global. And this is the first global crisis in my lifetime where we're actually seeing more entropy, not more global cooperation, which is deeply disturbing. And I think it reflects, as we've heard, a combination of 3 factors: the weakening of global order because of technology and gaps in income between North and South and within societies. China's role, which is complicating cooperation more than it's helping, frankly, and President Trump's America First approach, which removes from the center of global cooperation the actor that, for all of our flaws, usually is the one able to bring together consensus on new approaches. So it's disturbing. I'm not sure, however, that that's a secular trend. And we may find a few years down the road that there are new efforts and new institutions and new international collaborative efforts taking place. So it's a little depressing, but I'm not sure it's a secular trend. We should be careful about that. I also think that the COVID-19 chapter in our collective history is revealing how aggressive, and I would say how revisionist, Xi Jinping's China is. We knew this before the pandemic, but it's really in every category accelerated. The wolf warrior diplomacy. Sweden already was threatened by the Chinese ambassador with a shotgun, figurative, hopefully, and not literally. But China's engaged in massive social mobilization against democratic norms, against the United States. I have friends in Chinese universities who have shown me lists of well over 100 professors who've been fired for the crime of espousing universal values in the classroom. So this predates COVID. So this is a massive social mobilization campaign. It's ideological, but it started, in my view, within China. It was not an exogenous shock to the Chinese system, or to the extent it was a systemic shock, not a new ideological war from the West. And you see the latest manifestation in the aggressive wolf warrior diplomatic rhetoric of Chinese officials, with the important exception, thankfully, of Cui Tan-kai, the very excellent Chinese ambassador in Washington, who has managed to actually quietly speak out against some of his own colleagues' rhetoric. The operational tempo of the Chinese military, of the PLA, of the Chinese Coast Guard, of the maritime militia is up everywhere. The Sino-Indian border clashes, intrusions around the Senkakus in the East China Sea around Japan, operations in the South China Sea, enhanced now by China's 4 military bases constructed on artificial islands, which have allowed the Chinese maritime forces to maintain sustained presence in places like Natuna near Indonesia, where they never were able to do that. Very aggressive operations around Taiwan with a new Chinese aircraft carrier circumnavigating Taiwan. Increasingly aggressive interference in politics of other societies and states, notably in the Taiwan election, when the Chinese cyber campaign shifted from trying to discredit and undermine Tsai Ing-wen, their nemesis who won, towards discrediting democracy itself. And the New York Times reported, and I think accurately, that that U.S. national security officials have identified now, for the first time, similar disinformation campaigns in social media in the U.S. attacking the U.S. government, sowing doubt about the efficacy of democracy, the effectiveness of the U.S. government and U.S. institutions. This is a chapter out of the Russian playbook, which is known well to Europeans and Americans. We had not seen China doing that, but now we clearly do in Taiwan, well chronicled with the forensics very authoritative by Taiwanese authorities, and according to the New York Times, now in the US as well. The threat to destroy Australia's economy because of Prime Minister Scott Morrison's call for an independent investigation into COVID-19, which our friends in Australia stood down. They did not blink, and in the World Health Assembly received support from over 100 countries for an investigation. So across the board, we are seeing an acceleration of aggressive Chinese rhetoric, attack on institutions, gray zone coercion against states that oppose its territorial claims, and of course, the new national security law on Hong Kong. So to me, this is one of the most clarifying elements of what's going on right now is Chinese intentions. Is China successfully realigning geopolitics? I think the answer is no. This wolf warrior diplomatic attitude, as you've heard from both Carla and all of our colleagues today on the phone, on the conference, it's not really working. I mean, and part of the reason is because this is not just annoying, but this is a pattern of Chinese attacks on democratic norms and on institutions that matter to leading democracies. The CSCAP speech, the Shanghai speech in April 2014 was the first foreshadowing of this, when Xi Jinping called on Asians to settle Asian security without outside blocks. And there's been a constant criticism and attack on US alliances in Asia. The 17+1 is an assault on the EU, consensus-based vision of Europe's future politically, breaking apart ASEAN by bribing Cambodia and smaller states to block consensus if it displeases China. The Australian white paper, the New Zealand white paper, the European report on China last year, and the US national security strategy, although it was a little hyperventilating, all point out that there's now a clear shift towards more explicit assaults on institutions and alliances and organizations formed by democratic states. And I think this is part of the reason that China is creating more antibodies than it is winning friends, at least among major powers. I was President Bush's advisor on Asia for 5 years, and in his summits with Hu Jintao, Hu Jintao went out of his way to assure the United States and to assure President Bush he was not trying to undermine global institutions or US alliances. And those days, I think, are over, and it's become very evident in the past few months. I think you see China, as we've heard from the other speakers, winning friends, but they're really old friends, friends that were won through BRI, Serbia, Cambodia, some Mediterranean states, sub-Saharan Africa. But there's another trend which hasn't been mentioned, which I think is significant, which is increasing solidarity in spite of the Trump administration's difficult personality, increasing solidarity among maritime democracies. The US, Canada, Australia, and Britain issued joint statements on Hong Kong this last week that were quite robust. Japan did as well. The Japanese Diet, the LDP, leading committees on foreign affairs have called for canceling Xi Jinping's visit to Japan because of Hong Kong, which is an unusual emphasis on democratic norms by Japan. Japan's stimulus package includes $2 billion to repatriate Japanese supply chains, manufacturing back to Japan out of China. There's decoupling happening in Japan and elsewhere. It's very deliberate. The Quad, which includes the US, Japan, Australia, and India, is a little bit less robust, but the Indians now are doing more in their own way. I think what you're seeing in some ways is what might be called a Mahanian maritime coalition. You know, Alfred Thayer Mahan was the American strategist who argued that maritime powers could prevent hegemonic rivals from the continent. And he envisioned at the turn of the century that the US, Japan, Britain, Germany, he thought in the 1890s at least, that these leading maritime cosmopolitan states would maintain order in the future based on strong navies and common values. And in a way, you're seeing Mahan's vision happen. And you can see it in the way Britain, France, Germany are also focusing on Chinese coercion in the Western Pacific and the South Pacific. The problem with the Mahanian coalition is it leaves out some pretty important swaths of international order and international relations. Korea, South Korea, U.S. ally, is in an awkward position between the continent and the maritime. Seoul is pretty quiet on Hong Kong, is waffling on Huawei, and meanwhile is being beaten up by President Trump to pay, 500% more for U.S. bases, or else the president is implying he'll withdraw U.S. troops. So that alliance, which is a critical part of the U.S. alliance network in Asia, is solid. Polls show very strong support in Korea for the alliance, but it is I think under pressure from China and not well supported in the U.S. right now, at least not from the president. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN has been fractured by geopolitical rivalry. Vietnam, the Philippines, despite President Duterte, want the U.S. to compete with China. They're not afraid of that. But other countries, most other ASEAN countries, don't want U.S.-China competition, don't want to be caught in the middle. And so Southeast Asia, which is a critical and increasingly important part of the Indo-Pacific, is in play in some ways. And that's how Beijing sees it. And I think the same could be said of Eastern Europe. In some ways, Italy is the Korea of Europe right now, and Eastern Europe is the Southeast Asia. And these are on the periphery of the major and more powerful maritime democracies, G7 countries, but they are in play somewhat. And I think Beijing views a multipolarity and is going to keep pushing hard to try to neutralize or hive off these smaller states. And it should alarm all of us within the EU, within ASEAN, within the East Asian region. Part of the answer to the problem, and part of the reason this is happening now, is because I think states, these smaller states in the system, remain glued to the larger democracies by institutions, by the European Union, the World Bank, even the World Health Organization, U.S. alliances, ASEAN, the East Asia Summit, APEC, the Transatlantic architecture, including NATO. And one of the reasons China is making inroads, not with the major powers, but with these smaller powers, is because those institutions of regional and international order are failing. It's not just the U.S. fault, but a lot of it is because Donald Trump is attacking them. But we shouldn't assume that we will easily or would easily recover if Donald Trump loses in November, because this is not just about the Trump administration's retreat from institutions. This is also about a more aggressive Chinese strategy, which involves foreign interference, elite capture, which is a polite way of saying bribery. And so Belt and Road is not just an offering of capital that on easier terms than the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank. Belt and Road is expanding because it is creating debt traps, involves bribery. And so we should not be complacent and think a different president will make this easier for all of us. The fact is that the US and Europe, Japan, Australia, India, Indonesia, we all have to do more to support governance, democratic norms, because our models of development have their flaws, but they're also under assault. And we need to shed light so that developing countries, in effect, can leverage that to pressure China to be better actors in international development. So the last thing I'd say is we really need to knit together U.S. alliances in Asia and the transatlantic relationship. And China looks at the order and sees multipolarity, sees the major poles, the major powers falling apart. And we need to knit them back together. And I'd conclude by saying there is surprisingly strong support for this in the United States. CSIS did a survey of members of Congress late last year and found that this Congress, despite some bizarre outliers on the right and the left, this Congress is as internationalist as any we've had. Surveys of the American public by the Chicago Council, by CSIS and others, Center for American Progress, show the highest level of American public support for alliances, for trade, for international institutions, for global engagement, than those surveys have shown in decades, in some cases, and it all increased in 2017. So I think despite the challenges we have right now in the US political system, there is a deep and broad well of support for international engagement, including transatlantic relations, around which a future administration and potentially, although I wouldn't hold out too much hope, potentially a second Trump administration could build more of a united front, if you will. It's going to require alignment of our views. The current rhetoric out of Washington is not going to work, but I think the American public and the Congress will support a president who wants to rebuild transatlantic ties, rebuild alliances, rebuild institutions and global engagement. That's there. I don't think that has changed in the American body politic. But we have a lot of things we have to sort out over the next few months. So I'll end with that, Nicholas, and thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start my video. This technology is fantastic when it works. Well, I think it was 3 really interesting presentations, and even if you say you agree with each other, I think there was also distinctions between you that are extremely interesting. What we're going to do now is basically open up for a few questions from the audience. To the audience, I would also like to say, if you have questions you want to answer, please use the questions and answers, send them in, and then we'll sort of go through them at once. And also feel free to comment on your co-panelists' comments as well, if there's anything you would like to bring up. But I'm going to take one from, start off with one question from Julian Tucker here at ISDP. All the speakers have mentioned that COVID-19 is accelerating existing trends in the international community, especially then in the US-China relations. My question is about the EU-China summit, which is still being scheduled to take place in September in Leipzig, Germany. There's been some suggestions that European leaders and Angela Merkel is trying to postpone the summit until after the American general election in order to better organize their approach to Beijing. What do you think about this? Is that some truth into that? And I think that Michael has already sort of touched upon this, is what might the post-COVID-19 and the post-Trump approach to China look like? If there is a change, you know, there might be a second term of Trump, or there might be a new government, but what might the post-COVID-19 approach to China look like? Well, start with that. And if Alice, do you want to start?
Sure, Niklas. I won't pronounce myself on the date because this is a risky business. But I can tell you that there is, the nature of the debate in Brussels is really about strategic autonomy. It's about shaping China policy that is Europe's own China policy, and that is not necessarily a variable of China-US tension. Although China-US rivalry really is a challenge for Europe, for the EU, for EU member states. And I won't be the one to say that Europe has to position itself at equidistant, at the same distance between Beijing and Washington. This would not be realistic. It doesn't make sense given historical ties existing with Washington, given the existence of the alliance, given the nature of the debate in several EU member state capitals. But I think we should put in, I mean, we should nuance a bit the date issue, take into account that, I mean, in my opinion, I really expect a continuity of US-China policy. My colleagues based in the US would probably have a more fine-tuned analysis on this, but I wouldn't say that there is a full consensus, bipartisan consensus on China, because there is some nuances and some adjustments and some divergences between positioning, but overall, I expect continuity of US-China policy due to the nature of the debate in Washington, but also due to the point that Michael mentioned, is that it's not all exogenous. I mean, what's going on in China is not all related to what's going on in the US. As we mentioned, and I think it's very interesting that we haven't consulted before the panel, but we all agree that it's an acceleration of trends, because these trends have also been emerging with Xi Jinping, mainly Xi Jinping in 2012. And really, I would identify Xi Jinping as a game changer, but not COVID-19 as a game changer, and not the US election as a game changer. And I think it's always interesting to keep a sense of anteriority. As Carla mentioned, before there was this labeling of the Wuhan virus, etc., there was already conspiracy theory in Beijing about the origin of the virus and potentially, launched by US military, etc. So, I mean, there is a climate also in China that I think we should take into account, and there is a convergence of views between Brussels and Washington on this climate. I want to say it very clear here, because the time where US counterparts and friends were saying EU is naive, I mean, if there is still this view, it's completely detached to what's going on in Brussels and in Europe, because there is a convergence on the analysis of the current situation and the analysis of the context in China. This is pretty clear. Now the key question is the methodology, the methods to promote national interest, security interest, and also coordination and transmission of information. Sometimes the impression in Europe is that decisions in Washington are not first transmitted to Europe, just as for information that sometimes in that case, when you have an ally who is not always communicating and coordinating on key decisions, maybe it's important to have your own methodology, because if you just expect to be informed, you won't be. So there is all different there is all this element to take into account. But I really wanted to emphasize on this calendar and the continuity, but I will leave the floor to Michael and Carla. From a Washington perspective, I guess you have a clearer view on the election.
Well,
yeah.
Probably not a clearer view on the election, but I think you are right. There will be a lot of continuity in our China policy. At least I anticipate that. The difference is that we would have in a Biden administration an administration that would be committed to international institutions and working through multilateral organizations and using diplomacy to try to move forward a U.S. agenda. I'm not a great student of European politics, alas. China's a full-time job, and so it's hard for me to reflect thoughtfully on the question of whether or not the summit should proceed, on its current timetable. But I would think that because the world is in crisis, and Europe is sorting through how to move beyond that crisis, and you also have other issues still unresolved, like the Brexit challenge, that it would be wise to delay and ensure that there is a coherent agenda for Europe in response to present to. There's a truly united agenda when having discussions with China. There's been, again, I'm not a good student of European politics, but just reading about the decision, for example, to provide grants as opposed to loans to Spain and I believe Italy, that is a positive development. There are obviously many other kind of fiscal challenges that Europe faces, and I think the worst thing that could come out of a summit would be that that China tries to present itself as saving Europe from financial catastrophe. I don't think China's capable of that, but China certainly has, as Mike was saying, strong ties with many countries built after the global financial crisis, and it would be worrisome if ultimately the outcome was to further divide Europe on China policy. And also, I think there needs to be time to consult with the United States. And we are in turmoil right now, and looking beyond ourselves is going to be difficult. So I think having consultations with the United States, being transparent about European plans would be important, and that may take some time. So I'll turn the mic over to Mike.
I think Alice makes a really important point. She put it a lot better than I did, which is this new era of strategic competition. Some scholars may attribute it to structural factors and believe in the Thucydides trap and the inevitability of power cycles and all that stuff. But agency matters, leadership matters, and this is much more about Xi Jinping than it is about Donald Trump, as much as we lament what Donald Trump has done to some of our relationships around the world and our society at home. And Xi Jinping himself is not likely to change. When I've spoken to, part of the thing we've talked about today is the need for strategic dialogue. When I was in the Bush administration, Bob Zellick and I and two other officials had long discussions with Dai Bingguo, who was very close to Hu Jintao, and you could have a trusted strategic discussion. There's no one like that around Donald Trump who can speak with any certainty what the president will do, but there's no one around Xi Jinping who's empowered in that way. And this is a real problem. So I think Xi himself will still be likely president after COVID-19, and that accelerator of strategic competition is problematic. I agree also that there will in general be continuity in US-China policy in the sense that the American public and the Congress and elite opinion now broadly accepts that we are in strategic competition with China. One poll kind of says it all. In 2012 or so, when Xi Jinping proposed the new model of great power relations, a kind of, some people call it a G2, but it was really kind of a bipolar condominium between the US and China, with other allies and partners, Japan, Australia, Europe, sort of relegated to secondary status. The Obama administration was divided. Some officials, thought it was a good idea. Others thought, no, it's a trap. The American public, in opinion, was asked, should the US move closer to China now, even if it hurts relations with traditional allies? And over half of Americans said yes in 2013 or so. But when that question was asked last year, 2/3 of Americans said no. And they said we should move closer to our allies, our traditional allies, even if it hurts relations with China. And at that time, about half of Americans said China was a threat. But in polls since COVID, multiple polls, a significant majority, 2/3 or more, say China is a threat. So in that sense, there will be continuity. There's broad consensus in the think tanks, in the public, in the Congress, that we are in strategic competition with China and that China threatens certain of our interests. That said, we're a big, complicated democracy. And a sustainable strategy has to reflect the interests that make up this democracy. And there are very important constituencies like farmers, universities, state and local government that do not want decoupling because of their own livelihood, because of their values. There are others in labor and business who are quite divided. I'll just advertise briefly. We're doing a major survey at CSIS of key interest groups in the US and of allies and partners on where they think US strategic competition should go, how much decoupling, how much pressure on Hong Kong and so forth. We're going to try to map that out because whatever our strategy is, it's not going to be sustainable with the current approach. There are too many interests with China, but it's clearly not going to go back to where we were pre-Xi Jinping, where we assumed that we had more cooperation than competition. And I think the US political system is going to have to work that out. And I think allies are going to have a very important vote in that. And to be really a little undiplomatic, the allies that have the clearest eyed view of what to do about China are going to have the most influence. So that's going to be Britain. Excuse me, it's not going to be Britain. It's going to be Japan. It's going to be Australia. To the extent, and it's going to be France, frankly, because France is pretty clear-eyed right now about China, at least in Washington's view. It could be increasingly Britain, Germany, it could be Sweden. So countries that have their own clear-eyed view of what China means and how to compete are going to have influence in Washington, because we're trying to figure this out. And strategic people realize we can't do it alone, so allies will get a vote. All the more reason to have these kinds of dialogues. We start sort of narrowing the differences and finding out what the contours are where we can approach this in a like-minded way.
So thank you. Oh, actually, I have a question here also from Richard Forsén, who is the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung here in Stockholm. When he actually puts it to Alice there, in which, if any, ways have any rapprochement between Russia and China been consolidated in the age of coronavirus? But here, actually, Michael, you were touching on that too in Taiwan. I mean, something we have been looking at a bit is sort of the Sino-Russian cooperation when it comes to disinformation and all that. And Taiwan, of course, is an interesting case. But also what we see, Russian tactics and Chinese technology being put to work together. And of course, so what do you see about this Sino-Russian cooperation in the age of the coronavirus? Has it increased, decreased? You know, will this trigger something?
Well, if I could start, I think this was already happening before coronavirus. You had some unprecedented moves. The Russians and Chinese did combined bomber exercises over Japanese and Korean claimed waters last year, unprecedented. The year before that, you had Russian and PLA Navy ships coordinating their movement through the Senkakus. They didn't go together, but it was clearly coordinated to confound the Japanese. There was a lot of suspicion that that Snowden, when he fled to Hong Kong, that was a combined PLA-2 FSB intelligence operation. I don't know if that's right. There's a lot of suspicion, but now you're seeing more obvious uses of pages from the Russian playbook by China in social media and interference. So there's clearly a convergence, a marriage of convenience. I spent last summer in Mongolia, which was fascinating, because the Mongolians, who are probably the most strategic people on the planet, you know, Genghis Khan's DNA is alive and well. Their greatest fear was that Russia was being co-opted by China, and that they would be left vulnerable to Chinese, irredentism because they didn't have Russia. And they, in the front line, saw Russia for reasons of Putin's own idiosyncrasies and survival, kowtowing to China, and it disturbed them. All of that said, and there is also a bit of a cult of personality around Putin in China as well. But all of that said, we have millennia of distrust between the Slavs and the Chinese, which will prevent this from being a real alliance. Even with our troubles in the transatlantic relationship right now, we are light years ahead of where the Russians and Chinese are in terms of strategic trust and the ability to act in concert. But it is a new factor in international affairs. Began before COVID, I think accelerated a bit by COVID. I'd be interested in what Alice and Carla see.
Alice, over to you.
Right. To follow up with what Michael said, actually, I agree with all what you said, but I would go one step further, saying that, in my opinion, China-Russia rapprochement that has been noticed in 2014 in the Crimean crisis is more than a marriage of convenience. Because, as you mentioned, there is a military rapprochement with joint military exercises that are being held on a regular basis since then. There is energy rapprochement with a gas deal that is now effective. There is technological rapprochement as well, with 5G being partly developed, Huawei's 5G partly developed in partnership with MTS, the Russian operator on the Russian territory. But what tells me that it's more than a marriage of convenience is that it's not just pragmatic, there is a political and I would say ideological rapprochement. They share resentment against what is broadly labeled the West, and first and foremost the US. This resentment from Moscow and Beijing is deeply felt and has been entertained by textbook and official communication, and bring them closer in multilateral settings. I'm thinking, of course, about their position at the UN on diversity of issue, from the Korean Peninsula, North Korea, to I would say a division of labor that means that even if they don't have the same priorities, they don't overlap or they don't contradict themselves, being on CAR on the South China Sea. And if you look at cyber governance, you know, they have a normative approach where they would like to shape norms and standards in the field of cyberspace, I mean, the cyberspace. So there is a normative rapprochement that is going there that is not just pragmatic. They're really active in cooperation in terms of global governance restructuring. So I think, okay, COVID-19 is taking place in this context of rapprochement. I've been a bit provocative saying it's COVID-19 has consolidated the rapprochement. Let's say it has not put it into question. It's quite big already. Because if you remember, well, Russia was very prompt to close its border with China. And also within Russia, there has been a topic of tension with China, for instance, with the treatment of Asian tourists and students in Moscow, subways, etc. I mean, point of tension at population level that could have reached political level and become point of tension. And at the same time, also about treatment of some Russian nationals on the Chinese territory. But as a matter of fact, even if there is tension and divergences at population level, at official level, it's very strong. You know, I mean, the decision of Vladimir Putin to cut, I mean, to be prompt in shutting down, I mean, cutting the borders. I would have expected a very strong statement from Xi Jinping, as much as he has stated following Washington's move on this. But this is not the case. China, the MFA spokesperson, thanked Russia for its support in time of COVID-19 crisis. Communication is all rosy, even in practical terms and professional level, it's not the case. Before the crisis, Xi Jinping talked about Russia as China's best friend. And they will never talk about alliance yesterday, today, or tomorrow, because they actually converge in their criticism and their, I would say, strong attack on the alliance system itself. They consider it as well completely illegitimate in the neighborhood, and it's time to reshuffle all this. And they talk about friendship, whatever it means. But more concretely, to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on their rapprochement, I see three areas. One that you mentioned, Niklas, clearly, communication and disinformation convergence, in terms of methodology, but also in terms of messaging. Before, Russia was very prompt in underlying the weaknesses of the West in the messages, being on social media or others, but now China also is very prompt in doing so. I'm thinking about the way COVID-19 was managed. For instance, there was a well-known case of France where the embassy, Chinese embassy in Paris has, I can say it because it's very public and very well known now, but has openly criticized the way France has managed the crisis in such terms that this resulted in diplomatic tension with French Minister of Foreign Affairs calling, the ambassador to his office, etc. So you have this kind of background. But also if you look at the way the ongoing unrest in the US are covered by Chinese media, there is also very wide coverage in Chinese state-owned media underlying the weaknesses of the US system in a very offensive way, pointing at the so-called breach on human rights, etc., etc. So you have this area of convergence, communication convergence. Second is technological convergence. China started to help Russia in developing smart, safe cities infrastructure with video surveillance cameras and a system, basically a urban grid that is shaped after China's urban model of surveillance. And this has been accelerated, this cooperation has been accelerated at the time of COVID-19 For instance, if you look at cooperation with surveillance camera company Hikvision, not only with Huawei 5G, but also other companies, tech companies from China. And the third area of cooperation at time of COVID is institutional coordination. Russia is hosting the presidency of both the BRICS and the SCO summit this year. It has been postponed due to COVID-19, but you could see that both are very active in trying to shape a common position under this framework at the time of COVID, both trying to position itself as solution provider under this multilateral framework, and also both have called to joint statements, for example, about lifting sanctions on Iran or other positioning on key international conflicts that are currently going on at time and still going on at time of COVID. So all in all, I think it's more than a marriage of convenience, but of course we should not play with words, and I fully agree with you, Michael, about the key point that you were mentioning.
Yeah, just two seconds, and I mean, it has been, the Sino-Russian relationship has been elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership, whatever that is. It just keeps getting elevated. But I think as long as the two countries, as long as China in particular feels threatened by the United States, and a few people I know have described the current state of the U.S.-China relationship as a sort of analogous to the Sino-Soviet split. The Russians and Chinese will continue to deepen their relationship, and you've described all of the different levels they're doing that, and they're also doing this, and they're also cooperating in outer space in almost every technological arena. So it's a really I think, though, there are many fault lines that are exploitable in the relationship, but under the current situation, as with U.S.-China tensions heightening, it's unlikely that it's only likely that the China-Russia relationship will get closer and stronger.
I'd still rather have NATO and Japan.
Well, let me take one question from Alice, from Thomas Nordberg at Peace Quest International. How are current modes of global governance altered by the COVID-19 crisis with reference to the relative power stance of China? For example, how will US withdrawal from the WHO affect China's influence in said organization? And then we have a question to our US panelists from General Mats Ekman. To our two US panelists, the key factor for future international cooperation will likely be possible change in the current America First policy. And this is, will the domestic debate in the US over COVID-19 and the more than 100,000 deaths have any impact on the Trump administration's future foreign policy direction, possibly in a less confrontational view? I mean, I guess that's before the election, but also possibly after the election. So, Alice, do you want to start with the question to you?
Sure, Niklas. My view is that withdrawal, partial withdrawal of the US from some international organizations such as the WHO is undermining I say it's also a challenge for China itself, counterintuitively, because it's an institution itself that is becoming less credible, or that is suspicious of influence, of being influenced by China. And as a matter of fact, it's an institution that is less and less able to gather the first and second global economic power on the same table. So I would say that for China, I mean, I would say that more and more I really see a bipolarization of multilateral framework, some being increasingly suspecting of being under Chinese influence. This has already been the case with the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, or with Interpol, the police organization based in Lyon, which was headed by a Chinese representative before he was I mean, under investigation by the CCDI. So this suspicion has been going on for quite some time, but I think it will reinforce. But to the expense of the so-called institution, I don't really see how I don't see how this suspicion could evolve. I mean, could be altered. I mean, really, COVID-19 in that case was an accelerator in the sense that the WHO case will raise awareness in different institutions. But I really think that, you know, from a Chinese perspective, the approach toward global governance is threefold: is integration in existing institutions, such as UN affiliated ones, reactivation or refreshing of useless or not very famous institutions, such as the CSCAP that Michael mentioned previously, and creation at the same time of new institutions out of the blue, such as the AIB. And the one track does not prevent the development of another track. It's a three-track approach. And I would say that China, I mean, increasingly some institutions will be seen as under Chinese influence, but they will be successfully under Chinese influence, and you will have on similar global issues, for example, on security issues, you will have framework which are, I would say, where China is absent, and it's already the case, and you will have emerging consolidating framework which are handling or dealing with the same security topic, but without US allies, without so-called Western powers. And I'm thinking about the SCO, we have to see the evolution. I'm thinking about even informal forums, such as the Xiangshan Forum, that doesn't weigh much in the end at the moment, but is perceived as an alternative to the Shangri-La dialogue. What the ambition of China is to create alternative forum for security, multilateral security gathering, and step by step, it hopes to bridge this forum and institution in order to align the agenda and to gather a rather cohesive group of countries around Chinese agenda and Chinese position. I'm not saying it is succeeding in it, but I think we should not underestimate this rather flexible approach to global governance restructuring, because we already see bipolarization in existing institutions. So I see two trends. One is bipolarization within institutions, and one is bipolarization between institutions, with institutions increasingly having being seen as having a side, let's say. Of course, I'm generalizing for the sake of the analysis.
Carla or Michael?
That makes that I think that Alice has described the trends very, very well. I think China's also established some sort of bridging institutions. I just say, like the AIB, that follow sort of standard Western multilateral models and are comfortable environments for Western actors to participate in, but are headquartered in China. And although the charter itself is very familiar to in fact was drafted by an American, very familiar to Western countries, some of the operations are very different, and AIB also lends to countries like Russia and Iran, which have been excluded from the World Bank, for example, and I believe from the ADB as well. So it's a way too for China to normalize the engagement of countries that have committed violations under norms led by the United States into the international system that it's working to create. So I think we definitely see China trying to provide alternative approaches to global governance and norms, and I think the coronavirus, this crisis has really made that strikingly clear. It was much more ambiguous before this.
On the future of China policy in the election, I think it's a pretty safe bet that the rhetoric and the tensions with China will continue to deteriorate going into November, into the presidential election, in part because the Republican National Committee has done the polling and has decided this is the enemy they need to run against. And because Biden's not going to back down. Joe Biden's going to fight back and say that Trump is weak in China. So that's not a recipe for moderate language. And in large part because China will bait both sides. And I've worked on a bunch of unsuccessful Republican presidential campaigns. The Chinese are always very careful not to become an issue in our election. That's not true this time. They're almost going out of their way to antagonize the candidates. So it's going to get worse. by November. I'm not predicting war, but just the rhetoric and the dialogue will get worse. After that, you know, the problem, I mean, no president has won re-election with unemployment this high and polls this bad in history. But if Donald Trump does win re-election, it's a little bit hard to predict what will happen because there are two very different personalities about China. Right now, President Trump is talking very tough on China, but he could turn on a dime. He could capitulate to Xi Jinping on January 22nd. He could make a deal where he has a peace treaty in North Korea, pulls US troops out, says Taiwan has always been part of China. I mean, he's extremely unpredictable and has an affinity for authoritarian leaders. So it works for him politically now to be very, very tough on China. But that doesn't mean that 4 years of a second Trump administration would look like this in the president's mind. On the other hand, the national security establishment, the NSC, the State Department, the Defense Department, is almost entirely made up of former military officers who are very focused on competition. And I think privately they're a little bit worried about what President Trump will do when he meets Xi Jinping, because they want to win this competition. I mean, the one thing about military officers is they all, you know, in command and staff college, they learn how to think strategically and how to adjust and be adaptable. So in 4 years, if they may realize this is not working, we're losing allies, and push for more solidarity. I think that's possible, but it's a little bit unpredictable because the president himself is so unpredictable on China. And remember, at the beginning, as Carla pointed out, at the beginning of COVID-19, he was praising Xi Jinping. So that adds a little bit of unpredictability. I guess the one area of continuity is that in the Congress, the public, elite opinion generally, while there are differences over methodology and tactics, there is a broad agreement we have a problem and we need to work with allies and partners to deal with it. I always feel in talks like this that as the guy from Washington, I should apologize, but but as Lord Carrington said in one NATO meeting when all the Europeans were complaining about Ronald Reagan, the British Foreign Secretary said, yes, everything you say about the Americans is true, but they're the only Americans we have, and we need them.
Well, hopefully we do have a stronger transatlantic connection, and it's despite our differences, I think the similarities are still very close between Brussels and Washington, but there was many questions left. There was coming in questions in the end, and of course we simply run out of time. But hopefully we will have many more opportunities. And for the audience, I can definitely recommend publications of all three panelists. There are three of the most outstanding scholars we have on this, and of course practitioners as well at times. So thank you very much for enlightening us today, and hopefully we will see you in the future. So thank you.